we always used to say in meetings, like, I don't want to hear the good news, just bring the bad news. Like, that's all I want to hear. Because I just don't have time for the good news. Like, great. So, I
Yeah, if
wanted
it's good,
someone.
it's probably fine. Yeah,
It's
don't
probably
need to
fine.
hear
Yeah.
about
Why are you
it. Yeah.
telling? Yeah. Don't tell me about if it's good news.
Welcome, Mitchell, to this episode of Breaking Changes. It's our leadership season, and one thing that we've tried to do is collect leaders of all different forms. And I thought your story has been a really interesting one, so I'm really excited to hear from you more about it.
Thanks. Yeah. Nice to meet you. Nice to be on.
Cool. So yeah, let's start by telling the audience a little bit more about your background. What have you been doing? How did you get to HashiCorp? What are you up to now?
I mean, we could dive into any specifics you want, but the super abridged version is that I'm one of the co-founders of HashiCorp. I founded that back in 2012. Took it, was an executive through up to just about the IPO. It went public as a company, and then I started stepping down after that, and then I formally left the company just 2 months ago, just about 2 months ago now. And that's now I'm looking at some new things, but that's sort of the abridged version of my history. And for those who don't know, HashiCorp is an infrastructure tooling company. So I spent the past decade of my life really focused on open source, on DevOps, sort of related tooling, just categorically all sorts of things in there. And that's really where my head's been for the past decade.
Cool. So Mitchell, I have to ask, how did you convince your co-founder to name HashiCorp after yourself?
I didn't convince them. We both didn't want to keep the name HashiCorp. So
And you lost.
kind of, we both gave up is probably the better way to describe it. So the background of that is that I've had an entity, like a legal entity called HashiCorp since I was like 18. It's what I did all my like contracting type stuff under. So when I was 18, I did some contract PHP. I did some contract technical writing. Actually, I also did some video producing for like video educational content for programming and stuff. And so I had this HashiCorp LLC for a long time. And when I started, when I left to start HashiCorp, I didn't know what it would be called because Armand wasn't quite ready to leave his job yet. So in that interim, just so that I could put all the IP and sort of finances somewhere, I decided to roll it under this HashiCorp LLC. And then we raised a seed fund before we could talk about the company name. So we converted the LLC into a corporation and sort of put that all under there. And then, okay, the quick part is we're like, let's change the name. And we just kept getting distracted by building stuff. Like we would talk about changing the name for like 30 minutes. And then we'd be like, I'd rather just build stuff. And then it was too late ultimately.
Yeah, not a breaking change you want to take on. Yeah, that's really funny. I've wondered about that for a long time.
Yeah.
Cool. So I've seen a little bit online about what you're up to now, but do you want to tell folks what you're up to these days?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if anyone's really interested, I recommend they read my blog post when I left. But the short of it is, I was an exec for 10 years and a manager and CTO and various different roles, but always sort of really in a management position. And I've also been focused on DevOps. And so since stepping down from HashiCorp or formally leaving in December of 2023, I've really had a chance to focus back in on really programming really hardcore and looking outside of DevOps. So I've just been having a blast, just like playing around with different things. I think the thing that I'm most public about working on right now is a terminal emulator. And there's a lot I could say about that, but
we have seen
beyond that, what's that?
We've seen,
yeah. So I'm having a blast with that. We got a lot of users for that in beta, but it's really the focus is just around learning again and broadening my skill set. And I've been doing that for the past, since prior to leaving HashiCorp too, I was really getting back to an individual contributor level. So yeah, it's been fun.
Cool. No, thanks for that overview. So one thing that I've really liked about HashiCorp is you guys have just done things your own way for the whole time. You started remote first before it was cool. You have multiple products, whereas I feel like conventional wisdom is like you have like one focused product and other products.
Yeah.
And so one thing I wanted to ask about was which of those were deliberate decisions and which of those were it just happened to be that way and you realized it was fine.
All of those were, both of those, I should say, were deliberate decisions. Yeah. The remote side was, that was tense, I guess, because with investors and stuff, that was a tough one to nail down. But I mean, the motivation behind that's really straightforward, which is we were born out of open source, and I wanted to hire our open source contributors because they were the most obvious first engineering hires to do. They were already contributing for free. They seemed ecstatic to get a chance to do it, to get paid, and they were all over the world. So I was like, well, if our first 10 engineers are in 10 different cities, maybe we should just take it all the way. The other part of that made it hard was I wanted to move back to Los Angeles to be closer to my family. And so I did that early on before a Series A. And so me and Armand were already in separate cities. So that just pushed that all the way. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm super curious. This was pre, all the tools that popped up to make it easy to brainstorm on 0 to 1 stuff remotely. What kinds of practices, rituals did you two come up with to make it work?
Yeah, this is before everything. It's before Slack, before Zoom, before other stuff. I mean,
were
like
Skyping?
Before it all.
What was it like?
Yeah. We were using Google Meet for a while. I think that existed already, and Google Docs. We were just like sort of all in on the Google App Suite initially. We really quickly grew out of that. But I mean, I think the best practices we put forward were twofold, which was one was a huge writing culture, which isn't for everyone, but if you're going to do remote, works really well. And then the other one we put forward was a huge chat culture. And when I say chat, I think it's more, understandable now, but for a long time, I used to have to tell people it's not about putting text in a box. It's actually like, I used to call it chat literacy. I don't know if I heard that somewhere or anything, but I always called it chat literacy, which was this idea that you could be fluent in English or any other language, and you could be a good writer, but you still might be illiterate, so to speak, with chat. And that the example I like to use there is, can you really understand the difference between ending a sentence with no period, 1 period, 2 periods, and 3 periods? They all have different meanings.
I love
they deliver. That. Yeah. So I think building what I would call a chat literate culture was really important. Using emoji as a way to convey emotion in an emotionless environment. Things like that were fundamental to the culture that we built early on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've hired 2 people from HashiCorp, and I noticed there's just practices that they've taken, I imagine, from HashiCorp that really make a lot of sense. For instance, threading, React-Gs, being really emotive with the React-Gs. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. I know threading is a cultural controversial topic, but we're definitely a heavy threading culture while I was there, and reaction heavy, and it was all about the idea that you have to convey emotion in some way.
I love that.
Yeah, not just emotion. I guess like it is emotion, but like body language. Like when you talk to someone, you see the way their head moves and the way they smile and hands, and you got to recreate that purely through text. And the only way to do that is reactions, emoji, different punctuation. Yeah.
Yeah, a follow-up question, because I'm at Postman now, and my company Akita that I sold to Postman, Akita was remote. Postman is distributed. And so one thing that I've been playing with is how do we introduce, this is how our remote team interacts with other distributed teams. And so how did you socialize some of these things, like the, chat literacy, emotion needs to be in chat, things like that?
Really boring ways. I mean, we just had onboarding docs, just a lot of docs with examples and highlighting that it's important to us and things like that. There was no formal training, so to speak. It was just onboarding docs and then social conformity, I guess. Like,
that makes a lot of sense. Did you ever enforce it, or onboarding plus conforming was enough?
Yeah. I mean, enforce, I feel like has a lot of negative connotations. I would say we definitely, for new hires, definitely I would just DM, or I would encourage others to DM people if they saw something where they could have communicated better. One thing I learned early on is when someone, if there's a hierarchy, there's always a hierarchy in a company. If they say there's flat, whether the hierarchy maybe isn't titles, but it's just seniority, whatever.
Yeah.
But in a hierarchy, if someone above you tells you something, it comes off much more aggressive than if someone adjacent to you tells you something.
Yeah. I just had that conversation with someone today.
Yep. So we tried to build this culture where I wanted peers to encourage each other to do the right thing, because that way it wasn't so much enforcement as encouragement to do.
That makes a lot of sense. So you didn't so much have managers saying, hey, Sally, you didn't use enough emojis here, but people each other communicate better. Okay, I really like that. No. I'm gonna borrow that. Cool. So let's talk about the multi-product thing. I feel like the HashiCorp model is now a thing. I haven't studied a case study on it, but I bet there are case studies out there about the model you took. So where did that come from?
I'd be curious to see those too. So we had multiple products from the beginning. We definitely got a lot of pressure to focus on one thing, and the mantra of focusing on one thing I don't think is incorrect. Like I think we were going against the grain, and there's pros and cons to that. So our belief early on, Armand and I, was we were gonna go big or go home on this thing. If we once we decided to take venture capital, once we decided that was the funding path, we're like, well, let's just go big and fail big. That's the idea. So we had this vision of how we wanted sort of DevOps to work, and it definitely didn't all play out to what we expected. Like, not even close. It turned out in a great way, but I mean, different from that original sort of picture where we'd be in 10 years. But part of that was we had all these different products spanning different categories, and they would come together to complete that vision. So we didn't want to be, I'm very lucky and privileged that HashiCorp did work out, but in my mind, we weren't the company that was going to get bought for less than a few $100 million 10 years ago. We'd rather fail. We'd rather just strike out and go big. So that was like sort of the idea behind it. And I think that encouraged us to keep the multi-product nature of trying to get this huge sweeping win. It didn't quite work out that way. I think anyone external to HashiCorp would notice that there's a couple products that did a lot better than the others, and that's great. And so we sort of pivoted at some point to accommodate that. But I still am happy with the approach we took. But when I'm advising other founders, I'm pretty clear about the pros and cons of that.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess the natural follow-up question is, which things, okay, this is a two-part question. Which things went surprisingly smoothly, and which things did you think were going to be much bigger than they were? And, some of it's obvious, we don't really have to talk about it, but, sometimes if people are like, oh, I never even heard of that because it didn't make it, that would be really interesting to hear about.
So let's see, what went surprisingly smoothly? All of it felt a little rough at different times. I think as a startup founder yourself, you would understand what I mean by that. But I guess the one that went surprisingly smoothly in general, I'm not trying to focus on a product here. I'm just thinking about the whole company. But the thing that did go surprisingly smoothly was Vault as a product. We were really, really nervous about Vault because it's been long enough that I'm comfortable saying this now. We hid this for a long time, which is that Armand and I have no security background, whatsoever. We both took one undergraduate security class. We were literally implementing some of the algorithms in Vault from a Wikipedia page. We were really, faking it in a sense, but we were also being careful. We got multiple security professionals to review it. We got a formal audit before we released Vault. Like we were trying to do the right things to compensate for our experience, but I really thought that was going to be an uphill battle, and it ended up being our fastest growing product, I believe, we ever released.
That's awesome. And one of my views on security is I feel like usability is often more important than getting all the security principles right. And so it makes sense that if you're coming at it from a DevOps usability angle, it would be a really successful product.
Yeah, and I think we nailed that. I think a lot of people would hear me say that and laugh because they would probably say Vault's so complicated, and I wouldn't disagree with them.
Yeah.
But I think you got to view it relatively. Like,
Yeah, no, like
what existed
every
before
other
Vault?
product out there is more complicated.
Well, before Vault, I think people are trying to simplify it now. There's other products that are honing in on certain parts of Vault and they're doing great. But like, yeah, before Vault, things were way, way, way
Yeah.
worse. Like, Vault having an HTTP API was
Yeah.
groundbreaking. Before that, like all those sort of security products, they had weird custom SSH style APIs. Like
Yeah.
people literally had Rails apps SSHing to their security servers.
Yeah.
And so like, yeah, it's all relative. And I think that when you complain that a product has gotten really complicated or hard, it's a sign that it succeeded in a certain
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, what about something where it was part of your grand vision and then you just dropped it out of your vision because you learned, all right, that part's not going to work?
Yeah. So there's a lot. Okay, so when Armand and I started the company, we had all these products mapped out, and we dumped a lot of them. I think a big one that we dropped early on was a container runtime. So when we founded HashiCorp, Docker didn't exist. So on our list of products we were going to launch, there was a product that was actually what you would now call a container runtime. No one used that phrase then. So we just called it sort of like, I forgot what we called it, app packaging, I think is what we called it, the category.
Wow. Yeah.
But we had that, and we had a prototype even when Docker came out, and then Docker just blew up like crazy, and so that was pretty obvious that it would be an uphill battle, waste of time to even fight for that one. So that was something we abandoned. I'm sad in some ways because I think Docker architecturally all sorts went in totally different direction than what we were thinking, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in framing the question in terms of the name of this podcast, Breaking Changes, I'm curious, do you feel that HashiCorp succeeded in causing the breaking changes in the industry that you wanted to, or, you know, are there things still on the table that you're like, all right, HashiCorp is still on that journey?
They're definitely still on the journey. That's for sure. But I mean, I also think that in many categories, the company did succeed in those breaking changes. I mean, I think that the prevalence and sort of ubiquity, so to speak, of Terraform usage, Vault usage, things like that. That style of thinking is very obvious now. But it was controversial when we first launched the products, and I like to point out Terraform in particular because a lot of people see Terraform as this sort of category winner today, and think that we were first to do it. And I had someone actually come up and talk to me a week ago that just was talking about how when Terraform came out, it was like fifth in terms of like what you would use first. It was like in fifth place, like it was way back. And so there was a ton of competition. It was hard to sort of get going. I did a ton of conference talks explaining why Terraform versus other things, and yeah, so I think that's a success in terms of implementing that.
Yeah, I feel like there's not even other products that are named alongside Terraform these days.
There's some that try, but I think that in terms of influence, it doesn't feel like it. But you know, in addition to the technical stuff, I mean, I think the remote sort of thing, I think that succeeding as a company in spite of those decisions is a huge success.
Cool. Yeah, no, I definitely always bring up HashiCorp when people say, you know, you can't do 0 to 1 remote, or, you know, like how can you be connected? And I think you guys are a great example.
Again, pros and cons and all that stuff. Like I would never tell someone that a company must be remote or must be this or that. Like it's a choice on a scale that you have to pick. Yeah, makes sense. So obviously, I'm a huge fan of HashiCorp. I bought HTTP on IPO day, which I'm still holding on to. And you know, I continue to be a big supporter of everything the company does. And so from the outside, it looks like, you know, amazing journey, huge influence, all this stuff. But I'm sure you had your share of breaking changes internally. So I'd love for you to dig into one of those, like whether it's a pivot or just like, you know, we have to really rethink how we're approaching something, or, you know, any other kind of breaking change. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's two, and I'll let you pick sort of what one you want to dive into. There's a people organization one, and there's a technical one. I think the people organization one is hiring a CEO early and that sort of journey, and then I think the technical one is our total failure of an initial enterprise product that we sort of had to pivot the business model on.
Yeah, let's start with the enterprise product because I was planning to dig into the CEO question next. So
Okay,
I'll cheat. We'll get
cool.
both.
Great. So yeah, I mean, we first launched this enterprise product that was like all our products in one, and it was a total market failure, like completely market failure. We tried to sell it for about a year. I mean, yeah, we closed some deals, but it was clearly not going to work.
Yeah.
And so, I've told this story in public before, but it's like we had this one particularly challenging board meeting that Armand and I went home. We didn't even go home. We went straight back to the office from, it was like Friday night at like 8 p.m. after we got to the office, something like that. And we just sat in this conference room with a whiteboard and just like, none of us had to say anything. None of us said to each other, that didn't go well. We just, it's like when your parents are mad at you, you just know. You don't have to say anything. And so we both just went in there knowing it. We don't usually go back to the office after board meetings or that late or anything. And we just started brainstorming, like, if we could throw away, like, in our heads, no sunk cost, like, if it was free to do anything else, like, what would we do differently today? And we drew all the stuff on a board, and what we came up with was sort of like, we would do enterprise versions of individual products and sell those, and these are the features we'd build or whatever, and we painted it out. And at some point that night, maybe it's 11 p.m., something like later that night, we just said, let's just do it. We're early stage. Let's throw it all away. Let's not worry about past customers. Let's not worry about past code. Let's just chuck it all and start over on Monday. And that Monday, we convened in all hands with the company, said, we're doing this with the products. We're focusing on enterprise as a business segment. We're going to do, other like organizational changes. And it was like, it's something only a startup could do, which is like, you already have like 20 people, 30 people. You go in Friday, you come back Monday, and your whole business has completely changed. So
I love that. That's so brave. And I feel like, probably there are founders earlier stage than where you were who are afraid to make that decision because you would have to drop certain customers or, lose certain streams of revenue. How did your team react? Well, I guess there's two parts to that question. How did you set things up so that your team would react well, and how do they actually react?
I don't really remember how we set things up. I know that we were both really nervous to give this conversation. One of the reasons we were nervous, because one of the big changes we were introducing was we're going to be enterprise focused, and everyone we had pretty much hired to that date had come from the open source community, very indie mindset where we didn't know how they would take that. And I recall that afternoon, Armand and I really breathing a sigh of relief because everyone was stoked. Everyone was super supportive. It was pretty obvious internally that the enterprise product, the previous product, wasn't doing well. And I think there was a growing sense of concern of how is this company going to make money? We're getting to that size of people that, just lighting money on fire was becoming more and more apparent. So, everyone was just aligned with the mission of let's build a successful company. And they liked the focus because before that was one of the things we lacked. We didn't have a clear, this is our market segment that we're going after. So just us, I remember saying, we're going to focus on the global 2000 as a market segment. People were like, let's go. Like, that's great. We have a focus. So it was really good.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think that's a great lesson for, I guess, anyone out there who needs to hear it. Because I feel like there have been times too for me where I'm really scared to announce a decision or even make a decision because I think everyone's attached or as attached as I am to the status quo or more attached. And once you make and announce that decision, everyone's happier because people aren't dumb. they know when decisions are needed. Yeah.
I mean, it sucks because we threw away a lot of good work that people did and stuff like that. But, in that specific scenario, there were no layoffs or anything like that. It was just a total like restructuring of mission and refocus, and it all worked out really well.
That's awesome. A follow-up question I have about that is, when most people talk about getting their team together, it sounds like it was maybe 20, 30 people at the time. It's really in person, all hands where they can really feel your presence. And I feel like some of the other leaders we have on the season, the interviews where they talk about, announcing hard decisions or having hard conversations, a lot of the advice is get in person as quickly as you can and really, be together. And it seems like in this case, was the team remote?
Yeah, by this time Zoom already existed and stuff, so this was all over Zoom.
Wow. Okay. So how did you substitute the comfort of just being together in the same room and announcing a big decision like that?
We didn't really.
That's
We just
incredible. Yeah.
yeah, we were still small enough that we did weekly all hands with everyone on a Zoom meeting where anyone could talk. Like it was still like a very casual thing. And so it was during a normal, and I think at the time we did them on Mondays because I think it was just a very normal Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that we were very transparent then. You can be at that stage of the company. Every Monday we gave updates on download trends, on sales conversations. We just laid everything out there, and and so it was one of those meetings where we just talked about it. We're small enough where it worked out. Obviously, as we grew as a company, we never got everyone together for like hard announcements like that. But it didn't. Other things didn't universally go so well, and you have to do one-on-ones to really talk through concerns and things like that.
Yeah, but that's incredible that you were able to have a hard announcement like that remotely. I feel like, again, that goes against conventional wisdom. I believe it can be done. So I'm really happy that happened that way for you all.
I think it really shows, like, I think one thing startups can really do, and we got lucky that this happened at that stage, but when you're like less than 50 people, it's probably a much higher number, but when you're less than 50 people, you can really get everyone completely aligned on one mindset versus when you get to like multi-hundred people scale, it's totally natural that there's going to be differing views on what the company should do and more conflict and things like that. It's totally fine and natural. But I think one of the benefits of doing these big changes and sort of sprinting hard when you're small is that it is one of the rare times where everyone could be 100% on the same page.
Yeah, that's really that's really amazing. Cool. So now for my second cheat question, which is your other hard thing. So something I've been really impressed by, and I'm sure other people have been as well, is you've seemed really self-aware the whole time about what you do and don't want to take on in terms of roles within HashiCorp. And I think a lot of founders are not able to get to that point, or it's much harder to get to that point. And so a decision I watched from the outside with great curiosity was the pretty early decision to bring on an external CEO. And so the first thing I want to dig into is, what was that process like? And, how did you decide to do that? And then I want to get to just like your general like decisions about your role within HashiCorp, because I think that's just super interesting.
Yeah, sounds good. The process the process to decide to hire a CEO and then finding the CEO and then making the hire happen was very long. I mean, that was over a year probably total. But the process really started with the realization that the CEO job is something that that's the title I held at the time, and it was something that it was increasingly filled with tasks that I realized I wasn't very proficient at and I didn't enjoy. And then to me, that's a really bad mix because I think people could rapidly learn and improve at tasks that they enjoy, even if they're amateurs at it. But if you don't really like something and you're an amateur at it, then you're going to do mediocre at best. And so I had this dinner with Armand, and I told him basically like, look, I'm not having a lot of fun in this role. It's really time consuming and there's all these responsibilities. And so the initial reaction was, let's start splitting them. So we started with splitting them. And then that opened Armand's eyes, as far as I can recall, to, I think we had another dinner where Armand was like, wow, this job is hard and also not super fun. And we threw it out in the air like, if we found someone that culturally we aligned with and mission they understood, and we could
Mm-hmm.
sort of see a path to trust, like would
Yeah.
we hand over that title? And we said, yeah, but it has to be the right person. So
Mm-hmm.
that's when we approached the board and said, we just want to start a search that we're totally willing to give up on if you approve sort of the budget for the search
Yeah.
to find this CEO person. So that's how it started. And it wasn't, the board didn't even come to us, and I think we blindsided the board in terms of like we want a CEO. That was not what they expected to happen in that meeting.
Yeah.
And it wasn't forced at all.
I feel like usually boards are, like pulling the CEO position out from under the CEO with force. Yeah.
I'm sure it would have gotten to that point. I don't think that Armand and I could have. I think it would have been suggested at some point that we get a CEO, probably, but we did it a little bit earlier than is typical, even today. And then the search process started. That was so long and such a slog. So many dinners. I describe it as like, it feels identical. I'm been married now a long time, but it feels identical to dating. In a really weird way. You're just going to a lot of dinners with people. You don't really know them. They don't really know you. You're trying to figure out what you're both about, and it's not just professional. It sort of goes into like, what do you like doing outside of work? It's just all this like, and it's not just one dinner. If you like that, you schedule the second dinner, and then, when are you going to take them to the office? Like, it's just very like, it's so
meet the team. Meet their family, meet their family.
Totally. It's just like dating. Dave, ultimately we hired Dave as our CEO. I don't remember the total number of dinners we went to him, but it was so many that I was getting frustrated. Like, because I lived in LA and I was flying to SF every time to have dinner with Dave. And
long distance dating.
It was totally, and and it would be like super last minute. Like Armand would message me or Dave would email us and be like, "Can we have dinner again like tomorrow?" And I'd be like, "Okay, let me buy a ticket and get up there." And I was just like, "Okay." By the fifth dinner, sixth dinner, I'm like, "What's the plan, man? Like, are we moving forward? Like, clearly we're interested. I keep flying up here." It was frustrating, but yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned one thing I thought was worth digging in more on, which is if they were aligned with you culturally. So did you have a definition of the culture or what alignment meant up front, or was it a process of mutual discovery?
Yeah, so we have always had a definition of culture. I think that's important to avoid, biases and things like that. So our definition of culture is always in public. We call them the principles of HashiCorp, but
okay.
A big part of it is sort of like this idea, this culture of humility, pragmatism, integrity. They sound like things you would just like throw up on a wall and check a box, but I think especially if you ask anyone that's ex HashiCorp, I think they would say that they're very much lived in the company. Especially at that stage, it was like 100%. But it was this idea that, when we had a dinner with a CEO candidate or any sort of candidate, you expect a certain level of confidence, but there is a line between confidence and ego. And so we wanted someone who was humble about what they could do, what their job is, and interacting with others. We also wanted someone that was totally a straight shooter and not afraid to do it. So, we always used to say in meetings, like, I don't want to hear the good news, just bring the bad news. Like, that's all I want to hear, because I just don't have time for the good news. Like, great. So, I wanted someone.
It's probably fine.
It's probably fine. Yeah, you've already telling. Yeah, don't tell me about if it's good news. So it's like, when we were looking for a CEO, we wanted someone who would be super comfortable talking to the founders and saying, this is not going well. And like, this is what, we should do. So those are sorts of the way we defined culture. Yeah.
Okay, cool. How do you interview someone for humility?
It's totally, I've been asked a lot. It's something you could just, you could feel. I mean, it's sort of like dating. I mean, I think that, people are humbled. It's just like if you was not a professional environment, you meet someone, another parent at your kid's school, or just a friend of a friend, and they're talking up a lot about what they do, and they're, whatever. You could really tell how someone goes about something. So I think that was,
that makes a lot of sense. And one thing I wanted to follow up on too is, you know, I feel like there's a lot about how you and Armand were remote, but it seems like a lot of the critical decisions and conversations happened in person. So how did you
Early on,
balance
yeah.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, early on, I do think, I think that being in person is important. So like I said, I think remote is a range, and what you do in person, what you do remote, there are pros and cons. So early on, I was flying to SF almost, if I didn't have anywhere else to go, almost every week for a few days a week.
Wow.
And so we were doing a lot of that stuff in
Yeah.
person. That just slowly became less and less the case as the company got more
Mm-hmm.
established. But yeah, early on we
Yeah.
did a lot.
Yeah, I asked this because right now, our engineers are remote. I'm looking for an EM and a designer to work really closely with me. And my take is they either need to be in the Bay Area with me or close enough. Like does remote have a mileage radius? Is one one question I've been asking myself. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think early on, we used to have this rule. This what rule went away, but we used to have this rule that there had to be a certain amount of like time zone or time
Yeah.
overlap in the day.
Yeah.
You couldn't do like a total handoff at some point. Like you had to have overlap to be able to comfortably take meetings and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And the other part that wasn't, as far as I could remember, it wasn't really a rule, but we did assess like whether we want to hire someone based on the expense of flying that person to meet
Mm-hmm.
with other people of the team.
Mm-hmm.
So we did try to bring people together. On the flip side, we had this other rule, which is not what a lot of people expect. Again, this went away as we grew, but early on, we were really hard on it, which is that no two people on the same team could be in the same city.
I really like that actually. So there's one other person in the Bay Area and I don't see them very often. And I made that very explicit because I said, look, I don't think it should be skewed.
Yep.
Yeah. But now that we're hiring on IT engineers, that's been something I've been rethinking.
Yeah, I think early. So I didn't come up with that. Actually, the person who told me that early on was the then current. I'm sure it's then CEO of Automatic, who's the WordPress company. He was the one who told me that rule, and I didn't understand it. And we hired one person. We hired two people that were in the same city on the same team, and it was like a disaster within a week. Wow. It was crazy how quickly. Because what ended up happening was there was a team of three, and two were in the same city in the Bay Area. And on the first week, they were like, I want to meet my team members. So they had lunch together. And during that lunch, they discussed something about the product and came back on Slack and said, hey, we made this decision. And the third person immediately was really, I don't know the right word. Not the emotion is like sort of like upset, frustrated. Frustrated is probably the right word because he felt like they formed a personal bond that was unfair, that he wasn't able to form. And he felt like they made a decision without any possibility of him being present, which was unfair.
Yeah.
So that was the last hire for a while that we made in the same city.
That makes a lot of sense. Cool. So related to the CEO hiring decision, I wanted to dig in a little bit to just your personal decision of how you work on things. I was really inspired by your blog post when you stepped back into an IC role at HashiCorp. I also really liked your "I'm leaving HashiCorp" blog post. And so one thing I wondered then and now is, how did you decide what was the best fit for your interest, strengths? And I imagine there's some consideration of, that this is the best thing for the thing I created as well.
Yes, it's a balance. So I do think, in both those latter situations where I stepped down from the executive team and then fully left the company, I think the company was in a position that it was totally ready for that transition. But I think people put together the CEO change and those other two events in the same bucket. And I think they're a little different because the CEO change to me was a fully what's best for the company decision. And I think that the stepping down and leaving decisions were more what's best for me. And so there's a slight difference there. And so, my view was any startup founder, I think, sacrifices a lot as their company gets going and matures. And I felt like I did. And I felt like, we all did at HashiCorp. I'm not saying anyone did it more than others. We all did. And we put everything on the line and took it a long way. And then at a certain point, I was sort of starting to build my family and life priorities were starting to shift. And when that started happening is sort of when I started to have the conversation with Armand and Dave about I want to start prioritizing some selfish needs,
Yeah.
if that's okay. And so that's where we sort of started discussing that. So yeah, I have also always been someone, a lot of my friends tell me this. I think anyone who's close to me would say this, which is I've always had a pretty firm idea of what I want in life.
Yeah, that's
And
what it seemed like from the outside.
yeah, yeah, I've never been the person, even as a teenager, I've never been the person that's like lost or unsure what to
Yeah.
do next. I've always been like, this is exactly what I want to do next, and this is exactly what I do. And so I was pretty sure that I wanted to not be a manager. And then I did that for about 18 months. And then at a certain point, I was pretty sure, I don't want to work on infrastructure anymore. And it's not because I didn't find infrastructure interesting, honestly. It was just because I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It was because I like a lot of different things. And I felt like I always put that to the side and I was ready to bring that forward of like, I used to always be like, oh, GPU programming. No, I don't have time for that right now. But now it's like, I want to make time. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm curious, some people are spreadsheet people that, they kind of look at the whole space. They're like, this is the optimal thing to work on. And some people are a gut feel people. Yeah. So you're a gut feel person.
I've always said I'm a selfish driven developer. I'm focused on working on what I want to work, what makes me the happiest in the moment. I tell this story a lot of how Armand and I met, which was we were on a research project and he was a senior undergraduate researcher on the project. And he went around the room whenever people joined and I joined, and he asked everyone in the room, why did you join the project? And, it's undergraduate, college, university level research projects. Everyone's like, oh, I want to letter a rec. I want to go into academia, whatever.
Yeah.
And he told me, and I don't know, this is what he told me. He told me I was the only person his entire time that when he asked me that question, I didn't hear what anyone else answered. I didn't realize he asked other people. But when he asked me that question, I said, I don't know, it looks fun.
Yeah.
And that was it. That's how he sort of was like, oh, this guy's different. Like I didn't care about the letter of rec. I actually, I won't go into it, but that whole thing, I ended up like deleting the entire project that I worked on for a quarter in front of the PhD and didn't get credits. And it was a whole thing because, I felt disrespected and I didn't want to letter a rec. I didn't care about any of that. Like I was doing it for fun. So yeah, I think that's what always has motivated me. And I definitely put that aside a lot, for HashiCorp but not necessarily because I really wanted to work on infrastructure. Like it was really what I wanted to do. So that tracked for a long time, but now that's purely how I'm driven. Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I feel like I also operate similarly where people are like, how did you decide to do this? I'm like, no. Like the decision found me. And just, I like you wake up one day and you want to do something. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm just thankful, that I got lucky that like the reason I went into CS was because I liked programming. Like I'm very lucky that CS ended up being, regardless of HashiCorp, like my first few jobs, like ended up being a fairly like well-paying career relative to others. And then, I got into HashiCorp because I liked infrastructure and, infrastructure and open source and remote, all those things were not hot when we were raising. They were uphill battles and I got lucky and feel very like privileged that HashiCorp ended up succeeding beyond what we expected. And that's just, so I think there's a lot of luck to it, but that is how I've been able to make those decisions.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, similarly, I fell asleep doing all of my other homework, so there's only one major left. That's how I got into computer science.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't like I tried everything, but it was the one class, the one set of classes where I just always was awake, and so
nice.
Very easy decision process.
It's a good sign. Yeah, it's a good sign.
Yeah, cool. So one thing I want to dig into a little bit more is that career evolutions are not without breaking changes themselves. And so it sounds like you've been very much your whole career, but I'm curious, how has your outlook changed, or what's one big way you've changed over the course of the last few years?
I think there's obvious ones. I think that I used to make this joke, which sounds really sad now, but I used to make this joke where I would know I would know who was like when I was dating people, I was like, I would know who the right person is that I find when I meet anybody that I'd rather be with them than programming. Um, and that's pretty much how I made the criteria of knowing that my wife, like that's who I wanted to be with and things like that, was finding myself being like, I'd rather go hang
Mm-hmm.
out with her than be in front of a computer. And so I think family priorities are the biggest breaking change in my life. I remember on our first date, we both, she was super career driven too. I remember we both had this conversation on our first date where we both told each other, so if we date, you're going to be not top priority in my life.
Wow.
I'm doing a startup and that's all I'm going to care about. And she was saying, oh, she was pursuing acting. She's like, yeah, I'm pursuing
Yeah, I'm
acting.
actually a big
And
fan of your wife. Like,
oh,
there aren't
thanks,
that well,
thanks.
there aren't that many like Asian women actors. You know what I mean? So,
It's
no,
true.
not saying she's not also a really good actor. That's why I'm a fan. But
Thanks. She is, and she's super successful and did really well. But yeah, we had that conversation, and our family thought it was really cold and terrible. But like at that age, and that was what I was focused on. And breaking change was we had another dinner at some point. I don't remember the exact year, but I remember we had this dinner. It was probably like Christmas or something, some sort of big holiday. And I remember saying, I think we had that conversation. I was like, it's different now. Like, I think you're actually number one now.
I love
And
that.
it was early on, and that was like, it was scary to me, honestly,
Yeah.
because I didn't think anything could sort of dethrone that. And I started getting, even though it's a totally healthy, it's probably a healthier way to live life. Like, I remember being scared of being like, am I going to lose my edge? Is this like
Yeah, like
me
that's my
falling off the
identity.
wagon?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But I think for me, that was the biggest breaking change before kids or anything. Now I have a kid, and that's totally different bag. But yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like not enough founders really talk about that because you get the narrative like this has to be your main hustle. You have to be,
Mhm.
100% focused. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
cool. So now we'll get into the cool down questions. So these can be
Okay.
short. You don't have to answer all of them. So the first one is, what are the most underrated breaking changes in the industry right now to you?
I think the most underrated one that I'm seeing more prevalent everywhere is this reversion to, I'll call it like a reversion to speed or performance.
Mm,
So I think for a long time people chased, excuse me, I think for a long time people chased abstraction or features, and in the past bit, I think in terms of if you look at the JavaScript ecosystem, the Python ecosystem, sort of even the change from like Go and Rust and those sorts of things, there's a reversion back to, hey, maybe performance is going to help us here. So I think AI gets a lot of hype. I think various different things get a lot of hype, but I think that underneath all that, we're seeing a steady release of people focused on speed. I think the really funny one is how much of the JavaScript community runs on tooling written in Rust now.
yeah, this makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense. So I guess I've always processed a lot of data, or that's been my space. So speed has always been around me. And so
Hmm.
this is truly an underrated breaking change with respect to me, but it makes a lot of sense based on what I'm seeing. So it was very, 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 very good answer. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so next one I have to ask, what's your hot take on the breaking changes AI will introduce?
I mean, I think they're going to be big. But I also think like people give it too much credit
Yeah.
for what it's capable of. I'm also relatively speaking an optimist, so I think there's a lot of pessimistic views on how AI might, I don't know, destroy human creativity or make people like not want to work or something like that. And I hope it allows people to work less. I always hope that.
Yeah.
That's something I'm not super optimistic about. Nothing in history has really worked out that way. But I think that it will be a really powerful, it already is, and it will continue to improve as a really powerful tool. But
Yeah.
I also don't think it's the general intelligence that people hope it'll be.
Well, I feel like that's the humble value thing going on because
Maybe.
it takes a lot to say, like, we're going to create something that's going to destroy everything, smarter than all of us.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway,
Maybe that's why it rubs me the wrong way. I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah, no, I think for me, like, I'm
Yeah.
just like, look, guys, like, what are we saying here? That we are, as people, can create something like that powerful? Um, Yeah. Okay. So next question is, what change, personal or professional, are you excited about and you'd be willing to share? And like one note is this episode is going to run probably early summer, and so if the change is happening before that, the tense we gotta be aware of.
Um, so okay, I think that personal and professional. I think professional, I think the big change already happened, right? Which is me leaving HashiCorp. But I think that continuing to go forward, I'm just really excited about what that'll enable me to focus on and play around with, honestly. So I think that's a continuous breaking change throughout this year that I'm really excited about. And then personally, I mean, I think it's just being able to spend more time with my family and things like that. Sounds like a really cliche answer, but after I used to fly. I used to be my wife and I did the calendaring and realized that prior to COVID, I was only on average home about 4 days a month.
Wow.
And yeah, and since then it's been most of the month, but 4 days a month, and I think that that's sort of still something that I'm excited about and digging into there.
Cool. And final question is, for anyone who wants to hear more from you, where can they find you? What should they read?
Sure. I don't hide online. So I think if anyone wants to email me or contact me or see what I'm up to in any sort of way, it's quite easy to Google my name and find my website, which has my Twitter and email address and what have you. And so I'm pretty happy to talk to anyone who's interested and has any specific questions, but that's how you can keep up to date.
Cool. And this is true. This is actually how we got Mitchell on this podcast. I emailed him and he wrote back. I was very shocked.
Yeah. Yeah, I try to remain really accessible. Yeah, I do a lot of like random meetings with people, and especially if I feel I could help in any sort of way, I'm really happy to do that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like a bunch of years ago when I was a grad student, I got a random email from someone asking about grad school, and I wrote back, and my friend said, "Why would you spend time doing that?" And I was shocked.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not that important. I'm not that busy.
Yeah, I have family that asks me that all the time. I'll be like, "Oh, I have a phone call this afternoon," and they'll be like, "With who?" And it'll be like this student, and they'll be like, "Oh, have you met them before?" I'm like, "No idea, never met them in my life." But it's just sort of like, I don't know, if scheduling 15 minutes is easy, so let's just see if I could help at all.
Yeah, no, that's a good reminder, very inspiring. Because I feel like even now, I'm like, I can get you in 4 months. I'm doing someone else this month.
Well, it's a different situation, right?
Yeah.
Like my scheduling used to be a disaster. Post HashiCorp, I have much more calendar space. So
yeah. No, it's awesome. Something to aspire to. Cool.